Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. At some point in our lives, we're all going to experience the loss of someone dear to us. We don't want to think about the death of someone close to us until it actually happens. But it has happened. It's happened to millions of people during the COVID pandemic. And as a result, those left behind often feel swamped with the emotions of shock and grief. So today, Previn Karian and I are going to look at what happens when we feel the pain of grief. And can I just say to you, if you're going through this at the moment, then you have our heartfelt feelings with you. And I really hope what we're going to talk about today will help you. So Previn, perhaps you're going to take us through now why we grieve, the emotions of loss.
Grief and grieving, Christy, are some of the most difficult emotions, certainly as a psychotherapist, that I have to face and deal with. It is the hardest thing in the world because you are dealing with the fact of death. And there is nothing to debate. There is nothing to discuss. There are no opinions to be had when someone dies. It is a fact, whether you like it or not. And it is a very powerful fact. It reminds us that we're humans. It reminds us that we're mortal. It reminds us that we are finite and one day we too will die. So death is a very powerful emotion that comes out of that event. And death as an event triggers massive amounts of grief and mourning. And it goes all the way through to the core of our personality. Of course, there are many types of death. It isn't just the death of a person. It can be your sense of death when you lose a job, or you lose a relationship, or your children leave, or you lose a pet. So we can unpack a lot more, but it is about death and the emotion that comes out of death. It's very difficult.
Well, it's not surprising none of us actually want to think about it. I mean, when it happens, that's it. You have no choice. You have to look at it. But I think, speaking from experience, because I can think of 4 people I lost in my life, and they were all different. My feelings were different. They were, to some degree, postponed. And some people, when they lose someone dear to them, maybe a husband or a wife, they're so busy with sorting out funerals and wills and all these things that in a way they don't get round, perhaps, to feeling the feelings.
Yes, and there are 2 types of grief and grieving. One is an internalized grief and grieving, where you don't actually let any of that emotion out. So you repress it and you spend years of your life just carrying this internal crying inside you. And you don't really want to admit to it, but it is there. It keeps going on. You haven't forgotten those feelings. They are very present and actively press on you. Now, there are others, of course, who just literally fall apart, and the loss is traumatic, is the only word I can think of. And they are in pieces. They can't function properly. They're in tears all the time. And that's another kind of response. So you have 2 responses, some people who shut it down and others who cannot stop that grieving process coming out.
So if they shut it down, are you saying it will catch up with them sooner or later?
It either catches up or it will affect their behaviour and it affects their personality. So they become very easily triggered. They become very irritable and they don't quite know why. And there's some kind of loss going on in the fact of death that they haven't really come to terms with. If you push it down, you think you're okay, you think you're getting on with it, but you're not getting on with anything. It will go on inside your mind.
Well, I know there are various forms of grieving or stages, which we'll come to in a minute, but just to annoy all the men who are watching this, I have a feeling that men don't grieve quite the same as women, or they put it off longer.
That's absolutely right. And again, without massively stereotyping or gender stereotyping, it is a social convention that men have to grieve privately, out of sight, secretly, or not at all. And it has increasingly become a social problem, because if I'm correct in saying that it then affects your personality, clearly men are in a very unstable position emotionally, and they can't explain themselves why they're acting irritably, why they're acting so moodily, why they have these outbursts of anger. But there is some deep loss that they need to find a way to grieve.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about how they do that in a minute. I'm wondering, before we get to the stages, if you lose, say, a much beloved parent, are your feelings going to be the same as losing a historically horrible parent who you never saw for years?
That's a difficult one, and that depends on each individual. So if you haven't had a parent and you then hear that they are lost, because your relationship with them was so remote, it may not make any difference to you, because that death occurred a long time ago. They became dead to you. And sometimes children do feel that about their parents, that their parents are dead to them. Now, the trouble with that is, because we don't process that, we don't think about it, we carry a depression inside us. We carry a grieving inside us constantly, and we don't quite know why. So that's what happens with remote parents. Parents who are very close to us, of course, that's a completely different issue, because you're more aware that so much of your love, so much of your valuing and being loved and valued came from that parent. And of course, that is devastating when they leave at any age, because even though you think you're ready for it and you're prepared for it, it's a loss of meaning in your life. It's a loss of a big person, and it's a loss of all the valuing.
Well, your life has changed immeasurably. I mean, it just does when a parent goes. And when both parents go, that's particularly moving, I think. It's very difficult because you're on your own. You feel like an orphan.
Yeah, orphan and alienation are the immediate feelings that come out. And of course, death then impacts in so many ways. It makes you wonder, what is the point of life? It makes you question everything. And all the values that we go around chasing our lives and our days, and sometimes our nights over, suddenly become incredibly empty. And what death does to us is it reminds us, what are we here for? Are we really here for success? Are we really here for achievements? Or are we here for relationship? What is it that gives us our sense of identity and who we are? And usually it's the people or the person that we love.
Well, we'll come to different people we've loved and lost in a second, but I think it's quite useful now, Previn, to go through the stages which your profession has established as a means to for them to look at how we're doing with a loss, with a grief, but also for ourselves to kind of identify with. Could you take us through those?
Yeah, that's it's not widespreadly accepted, but there is a model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which frankly is the most pragmatic, useful toolkit out there to help individuals process that grief inside. And her book is called On Death and Dying. And Kubler-Ross proposes a 5-stage model. It's on our website in a blog that I've written, and it's been modified by David Kessler. Basically, the first reaction to death is shock. And there is no preparation for that actual loss. Even if somebody is dying, say, for example, with terminal cancer, you think you're getting used to the idea that they're going to die, but when it happens, it is a devastating impact, and nothing can get you ready for that. So the first reaction is often shock, and that's why people can't immediately grieve necessarily. They are in a state of shock at death, at the metaphysical fact of death. The next one, if they can kind of get out of it, is a stage of denial, because you can't process the thought that this human being isn't there anymore. You can't cope with it. So your brain reimagines and remembers all the great memories you had. It starts to become very nostalgic. You idealize the person, you remember the good times, and other memories start flashing back through your mind. Now, all of this is necessary. It is very useful, but it is a state of denial because you're not able to accept, but they're gone, and no memories can bring them back. Now, If you get past that stage, the next stage is usually anger, that we are mortal, that we are finite. Sometimes you're angry because of the way they died. It could be an injustice. It could be a car crash. It could be being shot by a police officer. There could be so many different causes of death. So there is a rage that starts to come out. The why do we as humans have to live this mortal, finite life where the people we love can die? So that's anger. And then finally, you get to a stage of acceptance. And that's when you know you can't fight death. You can't fight it. It is a fact. They are gone. And the horrible reality of that fact then processes into your brain, and that is an acceptance of the loss.
So at that point, the pain starts to become less, yes?
It becomes diminished, yes, indeed. But if you go through those stages, it is painful when you don't. Because when you don't go through those stages, you are blocking intense feelings, which are actually quite perfectly normal. They're quite human. And it's human to feel denial. It is human to feel angry. It is human to be in shock, because it is such a big thing, death.
So you hear of people who, we've talked about the people who put off the feelings, but the people who feel them acutely, that almost step out of a grieving process you've just described into major depression. What do they do then?
If they fall into a major depression, there are two things that are needed. One is that if you can get yourself to a bereavement counsellor, those emotions can start coming out instead of turning into a sort of sludge of unexpressed emotion. And that's the first thing that people need to quickly try and get to, is find a bereavement counsellor. We've got a helpline on the ticker tape below, and try and give yourself a space where the counsellor is focusing on nothing else, not your childhood, not your past, but the grief. And that's a very useful way of getting out of the depression. The other thing is to realise, of course, you get depressed. Of course, it's human to be depressed after the loss of somebody very important to you.
And it isn't helped by people who say, oh, do pull yourself together. You know, it's just quite normal to lose somebody. You do get such people, particularly if they think you grieve too long.
Yes, there is a huge amount of judgmentalism. And people get very contemptuous almost, that you can't get over this, you haven't got over this, and why aren't you coming back to work, or why aren't you coming back and being your cheerful self? Now, when it happens to them, of course, that would be a different story. Yeah. The person who is grieving has to withstand that judgmentalism and stay with their process and not be ashamed of themselves.
There's just two areas which are, I think, particularly difficult for people to grieve through. One is the loss of a child, which is just unbelievably difficult, I think. And people just, they can't believe why it's happened to them, why they lost their child, you know. And I'm wondering whether the process you've described works as well for someone in that position.
The issue of a child's death is an incredibly painful one. And I don't think there are any easy formulas. You see, this is why I started off saying the death is a very difficult emotion to work with in therapy.
Does it help if people have a religious faith?
No, because the loss is still there. And you can have as much faith as you want. You can believe in an afterlife. You can believe the child is still alive spiritually. You can believe anything you want. But the fact is you have lost a child. Now, we all know, for those who've had children, that the bond between a child and a parent is immensely unconditional, pure bonding. It is filled with love. And when that child goes, there is usually not the space to remember him or her. There isn't a space where it's okay to go through your difficult feelings, conflicted feelings. Sometimes it could be guilt. Could you have done something more, something different as a parent? Sometimes it could be regrets. Sometimes it could be immensely fond memories that keep coming up. But equally, it can be very bad memories of things that you didn't do.
Well,
so it's a horrible place to be when you lose a child. And I think it's conflicted, it's complex, and it's helpful if you can find somebody to unpack all that with.
Yes, and I mean the religious thing. Well, I mean people say, "Oh, well, it's God's will," but it doesn't help you, does it? When you're in colossal pain and you've just lost a child, or well, anyone really, it isn't helpful for someone to say, "Oh, well, it's God's will."
No, because that becomes judgmentalism again. You're judging the person for having feelings, and you're judging them for not having enough faith, perhaps, or not believing deeply enough. Well, the fact is, these are your feelings. And if you are a religious person, I'm sure that God really understands how upset you are. I don't think that God would have a problem with you deeply grieving and mourning and taking many years and perhaps never getting over the loss or death of a child.
That's helpful because you're saying, hey, you can't rush it. It's going to take some time. And it doesn't matter what form of death, it takes different people different amounts of time, doesn't it?
Yes.
I think the other area which is so painful, and it's something that we are going to be talking about in these times, is when somebody loses someone through their own hand, where they took their own life.
Yeah, that kind of death, and of course we will be unpacking that in another interview on suicide, but that kind of death is devastating in a completely different way because it's an intentional act, and that is something very hard to deal with for the survivors because they have to then grieve again while they're being judged, while they're judging themselves. And suicide is a very powerful act because it really punishes those closest to that person, and it sends a message that says, actually, you didn't love me enough. Now, I must make it clear that for the person with suicidal ideation, that's not what they're thinking. When they're going in that direction, they're not thinking, how can I hurt other people? But the fact is that when that act is committed and done and completed, the survivors are in incredible pain and guilt. So that kind of grieving, as survivors of grieving, again is a specialist area. Again, we have a resource centre on our resources link page that deals specifically with survivors of suicide victims. And you need to get organisational help to come out of the many complex layers that go on when you're grieving the loss of somebody who has taken their life through a choice of their own, intentionally.
Yeah. So we will talk about that. We really will, and have a look at it. I'm just wondering, without wishing to be insensitive, can I just move to another form of loss which causes grief? And that is when someone leaves you, a partner, walks away from your life and says, I don't want to know you anymore. Does that cause a form of grief?
Well, absolutely. And now you've come to the heart, actually, of what grieving is all about. And grieving is about the way we have objects of love. Okay, so people become love objects to us. And when they are lost, even in a relationship, you feel like you've lost your entire identity. And that's why relationship breakdowns can be so devastating, because the emotional roots and fabric of who you thought you were in that relationship are no longer valid. And so that tearing away at the core of your emotional world has a very, very severe impact on how you will actually process that type of loss. And grieving and grief means that there are many types of loss and many types of death. And we do need to widen out the whole idea of what is death psychologically. How does our brain experience losses and death? And it's something to do with the way we form our identity through objects of love.
And of course, when we are left by another, yes, we feel grief and we feel anger and we feel a horrible sense of self that we weren't good enough.
That's a very deep self-condemning, self-attacking thing that goes on in grief. And this is why that stage of denial, that actually you just need to come to terms with the fact it's over. And we don't. And one of the ways of keeping that going is to keep beating ourselves up. Could we have done better? Were we not good enough? And you were just who you were. So when a relationship breaks down, you have to find a way to move on. But of course, our brain doesn't work like that. So our brain says, oh no, but we still could have made something of it. We still want to hold on to that person. And it literally denies the facts of what has happened. So it is a complex piece of work to try and get through all of that pain and that self-attack that comes on you in the stages of grief and grieving and loss, and actually calm down and realise it doesn't matter what you think, how much you want to attack yourself. It doesn't matter what you think about that situation. It is over.
Yes, and that involves moving on from it. It ends at some point.
That's the difficult thing in relationships, is to accept the ending as a finality rather than keep going back. But our brains always do. And that's that stage of denial, isn't it, that Kubler-Ross talked about, that we nostalgically think, oh, but it was so nice and it could have worked so well, and I remember the time when we did this or that. And those are necessary. I'm not suggesting you short-circuit that.
Well, yes, except some people, they think they're wonderful people. They grew up thinking they were. Real narcissists think that they don't feel anything about anything. They just think, okay, well, somebody might grieve about that, but it's not for me. I just move on to the next.
There is a personality type that can go crashing through a lot of losses, crashing through a lot of destructive relationships, and thinks to itself that it doesn't experience any loss or death. And yes, the label narcissist has been attached to that personality type. Unfortunately for those people, there is loss, there is history. You can't get away from the facts of loss and death of relationships. And what happens is those losses accumulate over time, and they add up and build up, and if they're not expressed, they become a depressive, irritable, angry outbursting, uncontrolled and not really knowing why you're so angry with people, and eventually it leads to severe cases of depression. So you either mourn and try and face the facts of your losses in relationships, or you are heading for a very serious form of depression.
Or you take yet another person, forget the grief and the loss, go off to somebody else, buy a new car, go on holiday and feel absolutely great.
You don't feel great. You can distract yourself, you can alleviate yourself from situations and think you've got to a better place. But the accumulation of loss is a fact of your life. And you can't get away from that.
So it will hit you at some point.
Definitely will do. And then you have two choices. You either face up, you confront these losses and actually work out what on earth were you doing there? And why did you lose so many people? And what impact did you not just have on them, but what did it have on you? What is this trail of losses of relationships that you've left behind actually now add up to mean about your life? What does it mean about who you have been as a person? And these are the kinds of issues that go on in relationships where death occurs.
Well, yeah, as a psychotherapist, I think you probably have a better view of people. Lots of people don't take a view on their lives. They just go on and just keep on making the same old mistakes and experiencing the same old grief and loss. Well, they don't experience the grief, but they certainly know the loss and they cover it over and move on.
And the covering over and move on is the difficult part of why people come to therapy for grief and grieving. Because by the time they come into the room, they have been broken down. And it's either because they can't function in a relationship, sometimes they can't function emotionally or sexually, sometimes they can't function at work, they just can't live life anymore. And the world has become very empty, the world has become very grey. And there's a sense of a hollowness inside them. And they need to work that out with somebody who can help them make sense of the trail of losses in their life.
Well, just finally, I'd like to ask a sort of question about society, really, and whether it's lost its capacity to mourn.
Absolutely. Everything about death and grieving is pushed away. If you think about something like Remembrance Day has become a very formal event where we lay a wreath at the cenotaph, where you wear a poppy, and the sense that a whole nation is in sadness at the sacrifice of lives for the freedoms that we have simply isn't there. And that's because society doesn't value life and has tried to push death into the margins. So the situation now is that what society values and matters is billionaires going into space, That's supposed to be what life is about. And you can be like Richard Branson, and that's the goal of everybody's life. And unfortunately, whilst we try to keep pushing death out into the corners, it comes back into centre stage. So society has lost the capacity to mourn. We keep pushing it away. Even Holocaust services, remembrance days, which I remember as a young child were deeply disturbing days, but forced you to think about loss and death, are almost a political piece or a theatre or some kind of shaming. You know, oh, these naughty people, make sure you don't do it again and make sure you're not an anti-Semitic person. That's not quite grieving, that's shaming and that's attacking. So society has lost the capacity to mourn and grieve in several ways and at several different levels.
And it's particularly poignant at the moment. People watching this may have seen someone die as a result of COVID, which is awful. And they don't know why people aren't talking about it more. I mean, thousands and thousands of people worldwide, millions, have lost somebody. And are we marking that? Are we mourning them?
No, of course not. And that's an excellent example of why society just doesn't mourn, because society just does not care. The only value in in society today is money. Human life has none, absolutely none. So people can die and it's just their bloody bad luck. Okay, nobody wants to mourn, and you go off away with your private little grieving because all the rest of us are still trying to grab the cash, pay our bills and climb up the food chain and want to go into space and be Richard Branson. And unfortunately, society is squeezing out places of mourning, because when you think about death, it actually makes it rather silly that you would want to go out into space as a mark of your achievement as a human being. Okay, because death comes along and says, you're going to die one day. And you may not be remembered for this amazing event, but other people are dying all the time and you don't care. And that's a very inconvenient thought, isn't it, for society? So we are trying to live this consumerist, hyper-capitalist life where the only thing that matters is money and achievement. Unfortunately, we can't get rid of death.
Well, on that note, we will be touching on some of the areas we've talked about under grief and grieving. I hope it's been helpful for you. And of course, Cruise is a very useful organisation, and you can get in touch with us at ITT in these times. In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.